They never wanted you to hear this. In fact, by the end of this video, you may wish you hadn't, because what I'm about to show you doesn't just reveal secrets, it shatters illusions. Imagine this, a journal found buried in a wall. Its ink bled into the paper like a wound. Every page detailed rituals, names, children, blood. The Harrowell family wasn't just another pillar of colonial society. They were the architects of something darker. Behind their polished silverware and lace curtains hid a system of control so insidious, so deliberate, that even the devil might flinch. And this isn't myth. These were real people, governors, bishops, financiers, bloodlines that still hold power today. You've heard fragments, whispers about shadow families or secret gatherings in candlelit halls. But this is the descent. The Harrowells arrived in America not as settlers, but as sovereigns, not to build a future, but to finish what had already begun centuries ago. Theirs was a legacy imported from the old world, from forgotten orders and vanished kingdoms, and they embedded it into the soil of the new world like a curse. At the center of their estate in Ravens Hollow, Virginia, stood the manor, a labyrinth of secrets built atop native burial grounds, under starlight rituals and, older still, buried knowledge stolen from burning libraries. The house itself breathed, doors opened for no one, clocks that ticked in reverse. Visitors left changed or didn't leave at all. It was said that the family never aged, that their servants never spoke, that their chapel had no cross, only a mirror. If this sounds like madness, good, because madness is where the truth begins. And you, yes you, were never supposed to remember any of this. But you do, don't you? A sense that something has always been off, that there are rules to this world you were never taught. What if I told you the Harrowells helped write them? This is not just a tale, it's a key, and once it's turned, there's no going back. So lean in, shut out the noise, because the descent begins now, and when it's over, you won't just know the truth, you'll be someone else. In 1683, when most were fleeing the fires of European war and famine, the Harrowells came with something far more precious than gold: doctrine. They brought texts that had no titles, only symbols. They spoke of things not in sermons but in invocations, and when they settled in what would become Ravens Hollow, they didn't ask permission. The land was chosen, not purchased. Surveyors who questioned them disappeared. Natives who resisted suffered night terrors so violent some were found clawing at their own eyes by dawn. The Harrowell estate was built in exact alignment with constellations only visible during eclipses. Beneath the foundations, 7 subterranean vaults were carved, not by laborers but by men bound to silence, branded with marks even scholars today dare not translate. The house was christened in secret. No guests, no prayers, only a young child's scream echoing across the valley. Locals thought it was a wildcat. The truth was worse. You see, the Harrowells weren't just occultists. They were engineers of belief. They understood something that our institutions still exploit today. If you control the story, you control the soul. They embedded symbols in children's primers, hymns, and even household recipes. Their goal wasn't to convert, it was to embed. Generation after generation, layer upon layer, until obedience was reflex. By the early 1700s, the Harrowells had established charity schools for orphaned boys and girls across Virginia. On the surface, they were acts of grace. In truth, they were harvesting. The brightest, the broken, the isolated were molded, reshaped, emptied, and refilled. Graduates of these schools didn't just rise to power, they carried the seal, the mark of the unseen. Those who resisted vanished, records expunged, graves unmarked. You think our modern elites built their kingdoms on merit? No, their foundation was laid in blood, silence, and forgotten tongues. And it began here, with this family, with rituals spoken not to God, but to the ones that came before him. You were taught to dismiss this as myth. That's how they keep control. Keep you in the light just long enough to fear the dark. But fear is a leash. And this is how you cut it. Stay with me. You've only stepped through the first gate. There are 32 more. The deeper you go, the more familiar the darkness becomes, because this isn't just the Harrowell story, it's yours. It's the quiet inheritance passed through headlines you forgot, through laws you never voted for, through dreams you were told not to chase. Let me show you how they did it. In 1721, Elias Harrowell, third patriarch of the Bloodline, invited 12 men to the manor, each from a different colony, each a landowner, judge or clergyman, each with secrets to protect. What they discussed that night would ripple through history like an unseen hand tightening around a throat. They called it the Covenant of Nine Veils. On paper, it was a fraternal fellowship for moral refinement. In reality, it was a blueprint for psychological dominion. At its core was a simple principle. Truth must be hidden in plain sight, clothed in ritual, masked in virtue. The people must believe they are free, even as they follow commands they never heard spoken aloud. Within 2 decades, its members sat on colonial councils, edited religious tracts, and ran the port authorities. They could stop trade, silence a preacher, brand a heretic, and they answered to no crown, only to the Harrowells. Elias had given them more than a doctrine. He had given them language, words not spoken but coded, signals embedded in gestures, colors, symbols on rings and seals. Even the tilt of a hat meant something. That's why you never saw it coming. You were raised in their theater. The villains were always clear, the scripts predictable, but real power doesn't announce itself, it hides behind the ones who do. The Harrowells began to recede from public view in the mid-1700s, but their influence only deepened. They were no longer seen at council meetings or town festivals. Instead, they operated like roots under stone, shaping the world above while remaining unseen. They backed banks, printed sermons, and most chilling of all, they started to rewrite history itself. School books omitted names, events were redated, recontextualized, sanitized. And who funded these printing presses? Who appointed the boards of trustees at every new seminary and academy? You already know. The Bloodline, still moving, still watching, still refining the cage to look like a cradle. If this unnerves you, good. That means your mind is still your own. But for how long? Keep watching. The next veil is thinner than you think. In 1775, while the colonies braced for revolution, the Harrowells did something far more dangerous than pick a side. They picked both. Elias's grandson, Thaddeus Harrowell, quietly financed rebel militias in the north while supplying British regiments in the south with uniforms and ammunition through proxy merchants. Why? Because the war wasn't a risk. It was a crucible. An opportunity to rewrite power structures under the illusion of freedom. And in that chaos, they embedded their system even deeper. You see, revolution doesn't frighten families like the Harrowells. It excites them. Because when institutions collapse, so does scrutiny. And in the ashes, they build new temples, temples of law, finance, and education. In 1776, just days before the Declaration of Independence was signed, a closed-door meeting took place in Williamsburg. 5 men, 2 of whom would later be engraved into history books, met with Thaddeus. The agreement was simple: support independence in exchange for the right to shape its foundation. What followed was the quiet establishment of a private society known simply as the Hollow Ledger. Its purpose? To control debt, influence legislation, and erase any record of the Harrowell family's manipulations. Only 9 members knew its true origin. Only 3 understood its endgame. They didn't just want wealth. They wanted the ability to make reality bend around it. And the first thing they did? Fund the printing of textbooks. If you grew up believing America was founded purely on liberty and self-determination, that's by design, because those ideals were written with one hand, while the other held the ledger. Every institution born in the aftermath of revolution carried Harrowell fingerprints: banks that lent only to families within the circle, law firms that prosecuted enemies of the system while shielding its architects, churches that preached obedience over truth, and universities that turned curiosity into conformity. This was not governance. It was psychological alchemy, turning faith into fear, questions into shame, and ambition into debt. Understand this, the Harrowells never sought visibility, they sought inevitability, a world where every road, no matter how free it felt, led back to them. And now you stand at a crossroads. You can keep walking the paved path, well lit and crowded, or you can step into the woods, where the real history was buried. If you're still here, you've already made your choice. The descent continues, and in the next chamber, you'll meet the architect of memory itself. His name was Silas Harrowell. Born in 1799 under a harvest moon, he was never baptized, not in the church, not in water, but in a silence so absolute even his own mother was forbidden to speak his name aloud until he turned 7. They said he didn't cry as an infant, just watched, as if memory itself lived behind those pale, unblinking eyes. Silas wasn't raised. He was engineered, schooled not by tutors but by remnants, men and women brought in from broken orders in Europe, refugees of ancient cults disbanded by fire or force. They taught him languages no longer spoken, codes hidden in architecture, how to speak without moving his lips. By 13, he could recite entire books from memory. By 15, he was creating his own, filled with symbols even his mentors feared to interpret. But what made Silas truly dangerous wasn't his intellect, it was his obsession. He believed memory was the final frontier of control, that if you could influence what a man remembered and what he forgot, you didn't need to cage his body. You could imprison his mind. Silas went on to develop what the family called the mirror doctrine. It was never published, never printed, passed only through whispered rite. But its principles shaped every institution that came after it. The mirror doctrine proposed this, that history must not be taught as fact, but as narrative, that trauma, when ritualized, becomes obedience, and most disturbingly, that selective forgetting, when introduced early enough, could sever identity. This was psychological warfare at the molecular level. By the early 1800s, Silas had already implemented his techniques in 3 orphanages, 2 seminaries, and 1 federal office responsible for census collection. His influence spread not by fame but by utility. Powerful men needed tools to control an emerging republic. Silas offered them the perfect weapon, a way to manufacture citizens who believed they were free while carrying out commands planted in them before they could read. You were born into this system, so was your father, your grandfather. Ask yourself, why do entire generations forget the same truths? Why does every rebellion eventually circle back to the very powers it sought to destroy? Because memory is no longer yours. It was filtered through a doctrine you never saw, crafted by a man who believed that control wasn't about chains, but about mirrors. And now I'm holding one up to you. Look closely. The face you see isn't who you were, it's who they made. But you can still change that. If you go deeper. By 1823, Silas Harrowell had vanished from public records. No death certificate, no obituary, not even a grave. But his absence wasn't a disappearance, it was a transmutation. He no longer needed presence. His ideas had become architecture. His blueprints were embedded in the very institutions sworn to educate, heal, and protect. That same year, the Harrowell Trust, quietly renamed the Orenda Foundation, was established with a singular mission: to cultivate moral resilience and societal harmony through youth development. Sounds noble, doesn't it? That's the point. Behind those words was a machine. The foundation funded school systems in 6 states, mental hospitals in 3, and reformatory homes for wayward girls across the eastern seaboard. But what made the Orenda Foundation lethal was its use of compliance chambers, sanitized, windowless, decorated with images of peace and scripture. This is where children were brought when they questioned too much, where moral resilience meant learning how to forget what hurt and obey what hurt more. These weren't experiments, these were rehearsals for the world you now live in. The terms just changed. What they once called obedience is now called mental health. What was once silence is now called mindfulness. They dress it differently, but the purpose is the same. Submission disguised as healing. Let me be clear, trauma didn't disappear with time. It evolved into a curriculum. The same fingerprints you saw on the chalkboard now guide your screen. Silas believed that the future of control wasn't physical but digital, that one day memory itself would be stored externally, editable, streamable, ownable. That future is now. Algorithms that remember what you forget. Devices that finish your sentences before you speak. Voices that comfort you while encoding your decisions. Look around. Do you really own your thoughts? Or are they rated remnants of a doctrine you've never read? The Orenda Foundation never closed. It simply changed names, absorbed into think tanks, mental health alliances, even children's entertainment boards. That warm, familiar mascot your son watches on Saturday morning, designed by a team once trained in behavioral response conditioning funded by the Harrowell legacy. This isn't paranoia, this is continuity. A design so old, it feels natural. But it isn't. It's a fortress, built around your mind. And every time you agree without knowing why, you walk deeper into it. But now you've seen a door, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Keep walking. What's behind it is older than Silas, older than America. It's where the Harrowells began, and where your identity can be reclaimed. Before the Harrowells controlled systems, they controlled symbols, and before they controlled symbols, they controlled stories. Not the kind told by firelight, but the ones buried beneath monuments, etched into forgotten catacombs, whispered during eclipses by men who understood power was never meant to be loud. Let me take you back to 1096, the First Crusade. While the world watched armies march toward Jerusalem, a smaller, quieter procession moved westward, led by a figure known only in fragmented Latin as Ambrosius Harrowellus. No birth records, no lineage, just one sealed manuscript held in the Vatican's forbidden archives, Codex number 717. That codex describes a man with eyes pale as bone dust, who spoke fluent Aramaic, could recite every king's bloodline backward, and never slept under the same roof twice. Ambrosius wasn't a priest. He was something older, an interpreter of lost rites, a gatherer of fragments the church sought to bury. He disappeared in Galicia in 1103, and yet, 50 years later, his seal appears again. This time in Scotland, affixed to a treaty between warring clans that suddenly united to form a private monastic order called Domus Caligo, the House of Shadow. Sound theatrical? That's how you dismiss it. But Domus Caligo was real. Its remnants survive in the stained glass of 3 northern cathedrals, in the floor geometry of Edinburgh's Old College, and in the baptismal rites once banned for being too introspective. The order's purpose wasn't worship, it was containment of knowledge deemed too volatile for common minds, knowledge about resonance, about blood frequencies, about the storage of memory in stone and water. The Harrowells weren't just stewards of this order, they were the order. Each generation, one member was chosen to carry the right of obscura custodium, the keeper of the forgotten. Silas Harrowell wasn't the first to manipulate memory. He was simply the one who modernized it. But the original mechanism, the source of their power, lies in the ritual passed from Ambrosius through 13 bloodlines. They weren't chosen for purity, they were chosen for receptivity. Bloodlines more prone to disassociation, to trance states, to subliminal suggestion. Ask yourself why some families always find power, why they survive every collapse. They are not survivors, they are conductors. And you? You've been trained to look away, but not anymore. If you're still watching, comment this phrase twice. I return what was stolen. Say it, write it, claim it, because the rest of this journey will strip you bare. You've crossed the threshold now, and ahead is the altar. The altar wasn't built of stone, it was built of minds, layered, conditioned, sacrificed. And what they offered upon it wasn't blood, but consent. See, the Harrowells knew something the world still denies, that the most permanent form of control isn't forced. It's invited. Coerced subtly, yes, but always signed with your own hand. The altar was psychological, spiritual. It began in 1831 with a project codenamed Lustrum. Not publicly disclosed, not even to the Foundation's inner board. Lustrum's goal was singular, to perfect the induction of obedience through ambient influence. Think that's abstract? It's not. They built rooms, Ordinary rooms, classrooms, therapy chambers, offices, where everything from the wall color to the distance between chairs was measured to shift brainwave patterns, and it worked. Subjects placed inside these rooms, particularly children between 9 and 14, showed a 37% increase in compliance after just 10 days. But the rooms weren't the endgame, they were just preparation for the signal. In 1833, under the guise of a weather research project, a tower was erected in Vermont, exactly where 5 ancient ley lines intersect. They tested frequencies, tones, rhythms pulsed just below the threshold of conscious hearing. Within a year, orphanages in the surrounding 100 miles saw dramatic reductions in undesirable behaviors, but those children also began to forget names, events, who they were. This was the altar's cost, not blood, but identity, not fire, but fog, and the ritual didn't require belief, only exposure. Lustrum was declared a success in 1835. Its principles would later inform public school layouts, prison acoustics, even the background hum in modern psychiatric wards. You hear it now and think it's silence, but it's not, it's calibration. Every tone you can't hear has been tuned to make you yield to authority, to fatigue, to distraction. That's why truth feels slippery, why memories blur. It isn't age, it's design. The altar still stands, rebuilt in algorithms, in recommendation systems, in those little nudges that guide your thoughts each time you unlock your phone. They don't need you to believe anymore, they only need you to absorb. But now you know the altar exists, and once seen, it can't be unseen. You've knelt before it your whole life. The question is, will you rise now, or keep offering pieces of yourself with every scroll, every silence, every click? The descent deepens. Behind the next veil, the bloodless priests of the Harrowell dynasty, the architects of obedience. They were never called priests aloud. That would have been too obvious, too ecclesiastical. Instead, the Harrowells referred to them as curators, men and women with no official title, no public record, no traceable salary. But they had access, total access, to schools, asylums, government contracts. They weren't clergy in robes. They were doctors, architects, social engineers, and their sermons were written in blueprints, therapy guidelines, and curriculum rubrics. Their gospel was compliance. Their temple was the mind. The first known curator was Elias Harrowell, Silas's only son. Publicly, he was a child development specialist. Privately, he authored the 9 Levels of Integration, a psychological framework designed to erase guilt by replacing it with gratitude toward one's abuser. In Harrowell language, they called this emotional realignment. But the purpose was far more predatory, to create children who would defend the very system that harmed them. Think about that. Not submission under force, but loyalty through engineered perception. Elias tested his model in boarding schools. Girls who arrived from abusive homes were carefully selected. They were told they were safe, chosen, rescued, but their every move, every word, every emotional response was monitored. If they cried too long, they were isolated. If they questioned authority, their letters were burned. If they smiled at the wrong time, they were deemed unstable. And slowly the girls began to adjust, not just their behavior, but their memories. Within 6 months, over 80% expressed deep affection for the very adults who controlled them. They had been reformatted, a generation of loyal vessels. You've seen these techniques echoed in your world, in the therapeutic language that tells you your trauma is your responsibility, in the schooling that punishes defiance but rewards memorization, in the mentors who tell you to let go of pain without naming where it came from. These aren't accidents, these are remnants. The Harrowells learned early on, to conquer a nation you don't need an army, you need a childhood. You need a curriculum that wounds just enough to mold, but not enough to break. And you need priests who never look like priests, just kind eyes, credentials, and an office door that always locks from the inside. These curators still exist, not in castles but in institutions. You've met them, trusted them. Some of you were raised by them, but their names are not theirs. They wear the legacy of the Harrowells like skin, and soon you'll understand why your memories aren't truly yours. The next veil is thicker. What it hides is inheritance. Inheritance to the Harrowells was never about wealth. That was incidental. Currency was a disguise, a shiny distraction for the masses. The true inheritance passed through their bloodline was access. Access to silence, access to omission, access to the rooms where decisions are made, but never recorded. They called it lineal sovereignty, the right to erase without consequence and to implant without suspicion. And the heirloom wasn't a crown, it was a ledger. Bound in black leather, stitched with copper thread, the ledger of shadows wasn't a record of money, it was a map of influence. It detailed names, dates, leverage points. Each page documented psychological profiles, family secrets, suppressed confessions, used not for blackmail but for design. One entry from 1882 reads, Subject, Henry Vale, inclined to guilt. Father a gambler, sister institutionalized. Trigger, abandonment. Deploy emotional reinforcement via religious validation. Result, full compliance in 7 weeks. These weren't enemies, these were allies, grown by design. Now ask yourself, how many of your thoughts come from wounds you never chose? That ledger still exists, locked in a private archive below an estate in Luxembourg, under the guise of a cultural anthropology collection. It's not digitized, it's deliberately analog, because true power doesn't need convenience, it needs containment. But the legacy isn't trapped in paper, it's coded now, digitally transcribed and dispersed. In 1998, a shell organization named Alethea Systems was created as a behavioral analytics firm, funded by several trusts, including a donor-advised vehicle traced back to the Harrowell name. Their purpose? To merge the ledger's insights with emerging online behavior. The internet, you see, was never just about freedom. It was the Harrowell's cathedral, built not with bricks, but data. Every like, every click, every emotional spee, like mapped and cross-referenced against psychological templates generations old. You think algorithms predict your needs? No. They confirm your programming. They don't read your mind, they mirror your conditioning. The inheritance has been passed on, not to heirs, but to systems, and you are part of its yield. But the most chilling truth, you were never meant to question this. Every system was designed to flatter your distraction, praise your compliance, and punish your clarity. So if you're still here, if your heartbeat hasn't slowed, then you're different. You're not a consumer, you're a remnant. And remnants remember. In the next layer, we expose how belief itself was rewritten, faith turned into a leash, and God into a witness who never testifies. Prepare yourself. What comes next was buried under centuries of doctrine and bone. Inheritance to the Harrowells was never about wealth. That was incidental. Currency was a disguise, a shiny distraction for the masses. The true inheritance passed through their bloodline was access. Access to silence, access to omission, access to the rooms where decisions are made, but never recorded. They called it lineal sovereignty, the right to erase without consequence and to implant without suspicion. And the heirloom wasn't a crown, it was a ledger. Bound in black leather, stitched with copper thread, the ledger of shadows wasn't a record of money, it was a map of influence. It detailed names, dates, leverage points. Each page documented psychological profiles, family secrets, suppressed confessions, used not for blackmail but for design. One entry from 1882 reads, Subject, Henry Vale, inclined to guilt. Father a gambler, sister institutionalized. Trigger, abandonment. Deploy emotional reinforcement via religious validation. Result, full compliance in 7 weeks. These weren't enemies, these were allies, grown by design. Now ask yourself, how many of your thoughts come from wounds you never chose? That ledger still exists, locked in a private archive below an estate in Luxembourg, under the guise of a cultural anthropology collection. It's not digitized, it's deliberately analog, because true power doesn't need convenience, it needs containment. But the legacy isn't trapped in paper, it's coded now, digitally transcribed and dispersed. In 1998, a shell organization named Alethea Systems was created as a behavioral analytics firm, funded by several trusts, including a donor-advised vehicle traced back to the Harrowell name. Their purpose? To merge the ledger's insights with emerging online behavior. The internet, you see, was never just about freedom. It was the Harrowell's cathedral, built not with bricks, but data. Every like, every click, every emotional spike mapped and cross-referenced against psychological templates generations old. You think algorithms predict your needs? No. They confirm your programming. They don't read your mind, they mirror your conditioning. The inheritance has been passed on, not to heirs, but to systems, and you are part of its yield. But the most chilling truth, you were never meant to question this. Every system was designed to flatter your distraction, praise your compliance, and punish your clarity. So if you're still here, if your heartbeat hasn't slowed, then you're different. You're not a consumer, you're a remnant. And remnants remember. In the next layer, we expose how belief itself was rewritten, faith turned into a leash, and God into a witness who never testifies. Prepare yourself. What comes next was buried under centuries of doctrine and bone. They called it sanctity, but it was scaffolding. The Harrowells didn't destroy religion, they repurposed it, not because they believed in God, but because they understood the deepest prisons are built from hope. Let that sink in. From the 12th century onward, faith was their most effective tool, not as worshippers, but as architects of conviction. They knew that when a man believes suffering has purpose, he won't resist it, he'll defend it. That's why by the time Europe's churches began rising toward the sky, the Harrowells were already beneath them, designing the basements, vaults, reliquaries, chambers that never appeared in blueprints. What were they storing? Not relics, not bones, but scripts. Scripts to shape public devotion, to code submission into ritual. And it worked. Every kneeling posture, every chanted creed, every sermon that linked obedience with virtue, designed. You think that's conspiracy? Then ask yourself, why did the same 7 virtues repeat across 4 religions? Why were suffering, silence, and shame elevated while curiosity, dissent, and hunger for truth were cast as sin? This was psychological engineering under divine branding. The Harrowells financed monasteries, endowed seminaries, even infiltrated translation councils. Their fingerprints are on the first English Bibles, the ones edited, redacted, sanitized. Whole passages removed, whole meanings shifted. Take the Latin word metanoia. It meant to change your mind, but it was translated as repent. Why? Because repentance requires a priest, a structure, an intercessor. Metanoia, that requires only you. Too dangerous, too liberating. It had to go. And so belief became a transaction. Guilt became currency. And salvation, a subscription service. The Harrowells didn't care what you believed in, only that you believed under supervision, because faith unmonitored is revolutionary, but faith in chains, that's a tool, and every tool leaves a mark. Today that mark is on your calendar, your moral compass, your holidays. You celebrate rituals without asking who invented them. You repeat phrases without knowing who programmed them. This wasn't religion. It was ritualized obedience, marketed as divine truth. And the Harrowells, they were the publishers. You see, they didn't seek power through violence. They used something far older, meaning. They corrupted the need to belong, the ache for redemption, the terror of being lost. And they made you grateful for your chains. But now you see the forge. And once you've seen it, worship will never feel the same. In the next descent, we uncover the mirror language, the code they used to speak in public without ever being heard, and it's still being used by the ones who smile for cameras. Language was never innocent, not to the Harrowells. Words to them were not tools of expression, but containers of control. And the most powerful words were never shouted. They were whispered in mirrors. What does that mean? Mirror language was a coded dialect engineered to conceal command within compliance, a way to speak openly while hiding intention. Say one thing, mean another, and be obeyed without resistance. For example, when a Harrowell curator said discipline, it didn't mean correction. It meant submission through fear. When they said charity, it wasn't generosity. It was acquisition of emotional debt. Even education meant something else entirely. Implantation of limitation. Every word had a shadow, every phrase an inversion. You've heard this before and never noticed. For your safety. In the public interest. A necessary sacrifice. These phrases don't protect you, they prepare you. For obedience, for surrender. And you repeat them thinking you're informed. But you're reciting spells. The Harrowells embedded this mirror language into law, into politics, into education. Over centuries it became the common tongue of control, but it's most effective when you don't notice you're speaking it. That's why it's taught through rhythm, school pledges, hymnals, news slogans. They don't argue with you, they condition you, and once it's in your mouth, it's in your mind. Let's go deeper. In 1931, a Harrowell affiliate known only as LDH compiled the first lexicon of inversion, a guide for diplomats, clergy, and social engineers to encode directives within public speeches. It was distributed under the name The Rhetoric of Harmony and presented as a communication course for world leaders. Inside, pages of dual-meaning terminology, how to weaponize empathy, how to elicit compliance without coercion, how to ask without appearing to demand. Sound familiar? You hear it today in corporate HR, in health policy, in your child's homework. Community standards, collective good, corrective behavior, the grammar of guilt-based governance. This is no accident, it's heritage, a linguistic bloodline, and you've inherited it through culture, not consent. The question isn't whether you speak it, the question is whether you recognize it, because if you don't, you'll obey without realizing. You'll thank your captor, you'll defend your cage, but if you're still here, you're waking up. You're beginning to hear the echoes behind the words, and that's dangerous to them. In the next section, we enter the room few have dared describe, where Harrowell children were raised, where language became law, where mirrors weren't decorations but instruments. What they did in that house redefined what it means to be human. The Harrowell estate in Dorset was not marked on any official survey maps until 1989. By then, the original structure had already been razed and rebuilt twice, but the subterranean floors, those remained untouched. Beneath the manicured hedges, an imported limestone facade was a training ground, not for soldiers, not for heirs, but for engineered obedience. The Harrowell children were not raised, they were constructed. Each room in the lower levels served a psychological purpose. Room 3B was echo, no mirrors, no light, just recordings. Repetitive voice loops playing affirmations and contradictions in shifting intervals. You are worthy, you are nothing, you are chosen, you are expendable. This wasn't punishment, it was programming. Room 7C was mirror. Every wall was reflective glass. Children were brought there after failure. They'd be forced to recite their errors to their reflection, until their tone broke, until their posture collapsed, until their identity detached. Then came room 11A. God's chamber. Not a chapel. A lab. Painted black, ceilingless. No symbols, just sound. Frequency pulses calibrated to the fear response. Girls and boys as young as 6 would be seated in solitary, exposed to tones that matched cardiac stress. Some hallucinated, some vomited. A few never spoke again. This, the Harrowells claimed, was to cleanse the self. But it wasn't cleansing, it was deletion. Why? Because a child without a core is easier to program. They didn't want loyal heirs. They wanted instruments, empty, obedient, adaptive. That's what power required, continuity through control. Even bedtime stories were encoded drills, fables about silence as strength, obedience as transcendence, curiosity as sin. If a child asked, "Why does the moon follow us?" the answer wasn't because it's beautiful. It was because everything watches, even when you're alone. The message? You are never unwatched. You are never yours. Surveillance as love. Control as legacy. These children grew into men who signed trade deals with dead eyes. Women who recited humanitarian speeches while engineering starvation models, not out of malice but because their reflection told them it was right. And you have been ruled by their graduates, presidents, prime ministers, CEOs. You've voted for them, cheered for them. You may even work for one. Their training never ended. It just got funded. If this makes your hands shake, good. That's yourself waking up. But we're not done. Next, we expose the rite of passage every Harrowell heir faced at age 17, a ceremony so psychologically devastating it fractured bloodlines and birthed monsters hidden behind noble surnames. Ready? Let's go deeper. At age 17, every Harrowell heir was brought to the threshold room. That's what they called it. Not a chamber, not a hall, a threshold. Because what happened there wasn't a ritual. It was a rupture, a crossing, one from which no true self ever returned intact. The room was buried beneath the estate, accessible only through a corridor lined with ancestral masks, each one bearing the name of a family member who had passed the veil. The air was heavy, metallic, and not from dust, from memory. You could feel it, they said, before you saw anything. And then, the chair. Not ornate, not gilded, just iron, cold, and bolted to the floor. It faced a wall of pulleys and cloth panels, behind which stood the witnesses, the Harrowell Council. But they never spoke. They watched, in silence. Always in silence. The rite began with a simple command spoken by an unseen voice. Confess what cannot be forgiven. That was the rule. No lies, no omissions. You had to reach into the part of yourself that was still human, still afraid, and bleed it out in front of them. One mistake, one tremor, and the ritual restarted. Some sat for hours, others for days, but they all broke. That was the point. This wasn't purification. It was extraction, a forced purge of empathy, of innocence. And when the air could speak no more, when their tears turned dry and their spine refused to hold its shape, they were blindfolded and led into the second half, the corridor of mirrors. But these weren't reflections. Each pane was etched with the faces of those who had failed the rite, not in words but in residual emotion, despair, madness, guilt. Generational echoes burned into silver glass. Some heirs saw their own future in those mirrors. Others saw nothing at all, and when they emerged, they were different. Their voices flatter, their posture straighter, and their eyes detached, like looking through a man in Ted of at one. From that moment forward, the family considered them ascendant, no longer kin, no longer child, but vessel. This rite wasn't just a test, it was a filter. Only those willing to sever their last tether to humanity could lead, and those who refused, they weren't punished. They were erased, from portraits, from records, from blood. The Harrowells didn't believe in weakness, they believed in cleansing the will. And this is how they've remained in power, through generations of individuals who no longer flinch, no longer feel, no longer remember what it means to be human. In the next descent, we follow one who didn't survive the threshold intact, and left behind a message that was never meant to be read. Until now. Her name was Elora Harrowell, 19 years old when she vanished from all official family documentation, no death certificate, no obituary, not even a mention in the estate's internal ledgers. But she existed, and she left behind something no other Harrowell dared to: a record. A journal bound in black leather, stitched shut with red thread, hidden beneath the floorboards of the threshold room. Discovered in 1974 by a restoration worker who was never heard from again after reporting it, but a copy surfaced, a leak, and I've read it, every page, every word. And now, so will you. Elora's writings begin like a prisoner's confession. I am not who I was. I watched her die inside this chair. That's her first line, not metaphor, memory. She describes the threshold ritual in horrifying detail, but what's more chilling is what came after. According to Elora, the chair wasn't just symbolic, it was wired, pulses, frequencies, directed sound fields designed to fracture the mind's defense mechanisms, what we'd now call sonic torture. But the Harrowells called it refinement, and when Elora tried to resist, when she begged to leave, her own mother was the one to close the door. She writes, "She kissed my forehead and said, 'This is the only way you'll be safe from them.'" Elora didn't understand what them meant. Not then. But over the next year, she was assigned duties no other family member had been given. She was sent to observe a place referred to only as the Vault, an underground archive located beneath the Ashridge Monastery ruins. What she saw there broke her. Sealed rooms containing dolls dressed in ceremonial robes, paintings that changed expression when no one was watching, and scrolls, handwritten, inked in iron gall, describing rituals of transpossession. Consciousness transfer, not myth, not metaphor, practice. Elora's final entries become erratic. She speaks of voices in her sleep, of shadows moving beneath her skin, of a choice she must make, obey and become them, or vanish and leave a trace for someone like you. Her last page reads, "If you are reading this, you are not lost. You are chosen. Burn the chair, shatter the mirrors, and do not believe the language of mercy. It always comes with a mask." Then nothing, just empty pages. But that one journal cracked open the facade, because if one Harrowell tried to resist, how many more tried and failed? In the next section we expose what the vault really held. Not just scrolls, not just secrets, but something buried far older than the Harrowell name, something that still breathes. The vault was never part of any British heritage registry. Its blueprints are absent from both the Ashridge Monastery restoration plans and the Harrowell estate files. Officially, it does not exist, but its foundation, cold carved basalt, dates back to before written English. Elora's journal named it the Root Cellar, but what she called the vault wasn't merely a storage chamber. It was a containment zone. Beneath layers of false stonework and rusted torch brackets lay 6 concentric rings of architecture, each more primitive than the last. Saxon, pagan, pre-Roman. It spiraled downward like a reverse ziggurat. And at the bottom, the sarcophagus, not Egyptian, not Christian. No markings, no carvings, just obsidian, sealed tight, soundproof, suspended above the floor by 12 blackened chains. This was the origin point, the first ritual site. Every Harrowell ritual, every initiation, every psychological control mechanism, it all mirrored what lay here. Because this box didn't just symbolize the family's darkness, it taught it. What few records exist, scraps of oral history buried in suppressed ethnographies, refer to the object within the sarcophagus as the other son, not human, not beast, something unfinished. A failed fusion of consciousness and vessel. Elora described nights when the walls of the vault would vibrate, low harmonic pulses that caused nosebleeds in anyone standing near. One of the oldest texts in the inner chamber warned, "He dreams in frequencies, he feeds in agreement." That's the key. The Harrowells weren't worshipping a god. They were negotiating with a force, one that responded not to prayer or blood, but to obedience through programming. Mind control, ritual trauma, generational sacrifice, all of it designed to make the family tuned instruments, frequencies perfectly aligned with something ancient, waiting to re-enter this world through a network of hollow vessels. And what's worse, the vault wasn't sealed. It was managed, maintained, studied, and over time, replicated. In Cold War-era intelligence documents, blacked-out passages reference Harrowell protocols being used in psychological warfare programs, identity fracturing, sensory deprivation, symbolic reparenting. Every torture method you've ever heard about originated here. The vault was not just an origin, it was a blueprint, and now it's open. Because in 2015, during a private excavation by a corporate archaeology firm linked to the Harrowell's modern investment arm, the sarcophagus was unchained. Not by accident, by design. In the next section, we track what was released. where it went, and who in today's world is already under its influence. If you think this is ancient history, think again. The Harrowells planned for centuries, and their design is finally unfolding. The unchaining of the sarcophagus didn't trigger chaos overnight. That's not how the Harrowells operated. Their brilliance, if you can call it that, was never in brute force. It was in infiltration, infection, integration. The vault's contents, once freed, didn't howl or scream. It whispered frequencies, algorithms, patterns meant to reshape perception at the root level. Within 72 hours of the breach, 3 members of the excavation firm had nervous breakdowns. One gouged out his own eyes, claiming, "The visions weren't mine." Another fled the site, disappeared into the Scottish Highlands, and was later found carving spiral symbols into trees with his teeth. But no one reported it, because the firm wasn't just any firm. It was owned by Virek International, a private holding company with direct financial links to Harrowell Global Trust. That's how they've always moved, through layers of shell corporations, philanthropic fronts, and academic alliances. They didn't just fund the recovery, they orchestrated it. To bring the other sun fully into alignment with the modern world, it needed vessels, not people possessed in the cinematic sense, but architects of consensus reality, influencers, legislators, technocrats. The Harrowells began seeding key individuals across industries, media, medicine, defense tech, men and women who had undergone mental calibrations eerily similar to the threshold rite, trauma induction, sensory overload, identity voiding. These were not initiates, they were hosts. And you've seen them, heard them, believed them. Their speech patterns follow rhythmic logic traps, commands nested in comfort language. For your safety, trust the science. The experts agree. This is not ideology, it's programming. The same tones the sarcophagus emitted, now transposed into language, screens, sound bites. Every time you scroll past a smiling executive telling you what is best for your health, your wealth, your children, you're hearing an echo of that chamber. And here's the horror. It's working. Depression, detachment, division. These aren't byproducts, they are objectives, because the fractured mind is easier to fill. And the Harrowells, guided by the force they unleashed, are filling it. Not with truth, but with obedience, shaped like opinion. That's why this video isn't just a story. It's a mirror. And halfway through, I need you to prove you're still awake. If you've made it this far, comment this phrase twice to lock your awareness. No mercy behind the mask. Do it now. Write it. See who else has awakened. The algorithm will try to hide it, but we will cut through. In the next section, I will reveal how the Harrowells embedded control codes into early childhood education and why your memories of learning may not be yours at all. It begins earlier than anyone imagines, before the first textbook, before the first teacher calls your name. The Harrowells understood something crucial that governments only began to grasp a century later. He who shapes the child's inner language, shapes the adult's loyalty. That's why their modern influence spread first through education, not in content, but in structure. They didn't need to rewrite what children learned. They only needed to dictate how they learned to think. In the early 20th century, under the guise of progressive pedagogy, a set of learning standards was introduced in select private schools across the northeastern United States. These methods emphasized abstraction over intuition, compliance over curiosity, emotional suppression over exploration. But the language, oh the language, was gentle, wrapped in terms like focus, discipline, preparation for society. Behind closed doors, however, these programs were designed by a think tank funded by the Harrowell Educational Endowment, hidden behind 3 layers of grant shell organizations. Their internal memos, leaked in part in 1983, refer to children as impressionable biometric receivers. And the goal, to create what they called template minds. Minds that respond to authority not with thought, but with pattern recognition. You remember those word games from school? Finish the sentence, find the pattern, match the correct response. Innocent, right? No. These were early-stage linguistic entrainment protocols, designed to erode divergent thinking, designed to install response loops. By age 7, Most students in these pilot programs had lost the ability to generate self-originating questions. They could ask what and how, but rarely why. And that wasn't failure. That was the goal. A person who never learns to question purpose is infinitely easier to control, but it goes deeper. In the 1990s, biometric testing was introduced quietly in digital learning software. Companies like EduSense and MindBridge, both heavily funded by Harrowell descendants, began experimenting with adaptive curriculum tools. What did they adapt to? Your neurological compliance rate. If your brainwaves indicated resistance to programmed pathways, the material adjusted, slower, softer, more manipulative, until it fit, until you fit. Your childhood education wasn't just about learning. It was a shaping chamber, a threshold, one far more refined than the chair, but serving the same master. And if you think this is in the past, you're wrong, because now it's in your pocket, your child's tablet, the smartboard at your school. The program is live. In the next section, we expose the Harrowell code embedded in global literacy apps, how symbols and phonetics have been weaponized to install obedience beneath the conscious mind, and why the most dangerous form of control feels like learning. You were taught to read with letters, but what you weren't told is that symbols carry weight far beyond meaning. They carry frequency. Every character your eyes trace, every phoneme your mouth sounds out, it all vibrates, resonates. And the Harrowells knew exactly which combinations could slip past cognition and speak directly to the limbic core. In 2004, a literacy initiative swept through English-speaking countries under the banner of educational equality. Apps like BrightMind, LexiLoop, and PhonoStart were hailed as revolutionary tools for accelerating early reading. But no one bothered to ask who built them. All three were quietly developed by a software lab operating under a holding group called Orbis Foundation. The founder, Elias Harrowell IV, a tech philanthropist with no educational background, yet somehow he secured direct contracts with multiple ministries of education. The interface of these apps wasn't random. The color schemes triggered emotional docility, soft blues and pale greens that dampened cognitive resistance. The reward tones were reverse engineered from meditation bell frequencies known to induce trance-like suggestibility. But the real weapon was in the phonetic sequencing. Certain word sets repeated far more often than statistically normal. Obey, follow, still, order, stay, control. Words you'd never notice as dangerous because they're part of normal vocabulary, but when combined with frequency-tuned audio and subliminal visual cues, they act as anchors. Anchors for mental postures, neurological positions of submission. Over 42% of children who used these apps between 2006 and 2016 showed reduced scores in divergent problem solving, but increased scores in instruction retention. Translation? They became excellent at repeating back what they were told and worse at questioning why. But it goes even deeper. In a 2013 audit of the LexiLoop backend, servers leaked anonymously, researchers discovered a function labeled spectral loop mode. When activated, the app would introduce a subtle strobe modulation, imperceptible to the eye, timed to the user's blinking rate. Why? Because blink entrainment is one of the oldest techniques for priming the subconscious mind, used in ritual, used in torture, used in the chair. The code's purpose wasn't education, it was imprinting, installation of pre-consent, so that when the time came for obedience to be demanded, the neural path had already been paved. And this is just one layer. The Harrowells aren't teaching your children, they're sculpting them. In the next section, we'll expose the symbol sequences buried in common children's books, how entire generations have been conditioned to normalize surveillance, silence dissent, and accept authority without proof, because the storybooks weren't written for innocence, they were written for programming. They sit on every nursery shelf, bright covers, smiling animals, rhyming text that lulls a child's mind into stillness. But behind the sing-song cadence and watercolor drawings, something ancient stirs, something the Harrowells embedded with surgical precision. It isn't about what the books say, it's about what they install. Take Timmy's Watchful Friend, a book distributed for free to over 4 million households through a literacy initiative backed by the Luma Harrowell Foundation. On the surface, it tells the story of a boy and his magical owl who helps him make good choices. But page after page reinforces a specific behavior loop. Timmy is rewarded only when he listens to the owl. The owl sees everything, even when Timmy's alone. And Timmy feels guilty when he thinks something the owl might not like. Now understand this. In neurolinguistic programming, repetition of surveillance motifs during early developmental phases creates what's known as internalized observer syndrome. The child grows up feeling watched, not just by parents or society, but by a permanent, unseen presence. A conscience, yes, but one not their own. That's not morality, that's installation. Another book, The Garden of Perfect Order, tells of a land that descends into chaos because one flower refuses to grow in the right direction. The solution? All flowers must be trimmed, even the healthy ones. The message cloaked in metaphor. Individuality threatens harmony. Conformity ensures peace. And in the final scene, the garden is quiet again, silent, colorless, uniform. The child closes the book feeling calm. But what just happened is emotional anesthesia. These aren't isolated examples. Between 1998 and 2019, over 200 titles for early readers were traced to publishers receiving direct funding from the Harrowell Cultural Trust. Their stories repeated the same themes. Surveillance equals safety. Rules are love. Feelings must be managed. Outsiders bring danger. It's a perfect storm. Visual sweetness masks ideological poison. You don't fight these ideas, you absorb them. And they don't vanish in adulthood. They become your instincts. You censor yourself before speaking. You police your thoughts before acting. You hear the owl's voice, and you obey, not because you're weak, but because you were trained to. In the next section, we'll follow that voice deeper, into the Harrowell's infiltration of early television and digital animation. Because when the stories entered screens, the programming accelerated. Faster, sharper, stronger. The voice became everywhere. In 1992, a quiet media acquisition changed the future of children's programming. A shell company registered in Luxembourg, Parallax Holdings Limited, acquired majority shares in a struggling animation studio known then for harmless puppet shows and educational cartoons. Within 5 years, that studio became Hollow Tree Media, producing over 800 hours of content for children aged 3 to 11. But what parents didn't know, what they were never supposed to know, is that the Harrowell family controlled Parallax. They didn't buy the studio to make cartoons, they bought it to mass-produce ritualized perception loops. Shows like The Curious Mirror and Elias the Explorer became international hits, but hidden in the pacing, the camera angles, the vocal intonation, were neurological directives. In one infamous study buried by 3 separate educational boards, child EEG scans showed that watching Hollow Tree's programming for just 15 minutes caused a measurable drop in theta wave variability, essentially reducing the brain's dreamlike cognitive flexibility. In adults, this kind of wave suppression is induced through sedation or hypnosis, but here it was being done with colors and rhymes, and it was effective. The Curious Mirror's entire premise involved a child who could only see the truth if he stared into his magical mirror and repeated a mantra. I see what I'm told, I do what I'm shown. The mantra changes slightly episode to episode, but the loop remains. Obedience equals clarity, independence equals confusion, and this wasn't an isolated series. Across Hollow Tree's programming, similar constructs appear. A guide who knows all, a reward for conformity, a punishment for questioning. One show even featured a dream chair where children sat to receive stories that could only be heard if they cleared their minds and sat very still. The pose, identical to the Harrowell Eine. Tiation Right recorded in the Bleached Chamber, 1846. This isn't nostalgia, it's engineered memory distortion. These shows didn't entertain your inner child, they rewired him. And today, the descendants of those same programs exist on every platform. YouTube Kids, smart TVs, educational apps. The same coding principles, the same pacing. Only now it's interactive, and the device watches you. In the next section, we'll reveal the Harrowell framework hidden in popular bedtime rituals, the lullabies, the breathing exercises, the mindfulness trends that don't calm your child. They condition them for passivity. They tell you bedtime is sacred, that routines help children sleep, that lullabies soothe and nightly affirmations build confidence. But what if I told you these rituals weren't created to comfort? They were engineered to install. The Harrowells didn't just manipulate institutions, they infiltrated intimacy. In 2007, the Harrowell Sleep Institute, under the guise of child wellness research, released a recommended bedtime routine adopted by hundreds of hospitals and pediatric clinics across the US. It was hailed as developmentally ideal, but its origins trace back to 1893, when Lucien Harrowell commissioned a series of behavioral tests at the Belmont Asylum. The goal? Create a sleep protocol that would bypass conscious resistance and allow for suggestion absorption. Fast forward to today's version. Dim light, lavender scent, soft voice tone, rhythmic repetition, followed by embedded affirmations. On paper it sounds loving, but what are the actual affirmations? I am safe when I listen. I feel good when I follow rules. My thoughts are quiet when I obey. These phrases appear in over 30 best-selling children's bedtime books, most with ties to publishing houses seeded by the Harrowell Literary Trust. You see, they don't force belief, they drip-feed it, night after night, phrase after phrase, until the child begins to associate relaxation, not with freedom, but with submission. Even the breathing techniques, which claim to be based on mindfulness, are not rooted in ancient tradition. They're modeled on passivity induction methods used in classified psychological experiments during the Cold War, techniques designed to lower resistance in detainees before interrogation. The rhythm, 4 seconds in, 6 seconds out, triggers parasympathetic dominance, a state where the body is calm but the mind is vulnerable. And the final step? Sleep sounds, ocean waves, white noise, binaural beats. T frequencies embedded at imperceptible levels, alpha dampening signals that suppress independent thought formation during early REM cycles. Not conspiracy, patented technology. Look it up. The Harrowells didn't just want control of your waking attention, they wanted your sleep. Because the mind doesn't stop processing when the eyes close. It becomes more pliable. And if you think this only affects children, wait until you realize the same principles are used in adult sleep apps. The calm you feel, it's not peace, it's permissioned surrender. In the next section, we'll expose how the Harrowells embedded these same control principles into adult meditation culture, turning personal enlightenment into programmed compliance. Close your eyes, breathe in, let go. That's what they tell you. But what exactly are you letting go of? Your stress or your sovereignty? The Harrowells didn't stop at childhood conditioning. They knew real control required penetration into the adult psyche, especially among those seeking awakening. So they rebranded domination as healing. Beginning in 2011, a massive wave of meditation apps flooded the market, all boasting calming voices, ambient sounds, and guided scripts designed to bring clarity. What few realized is that many of these companies, Calm Core, Third Light, Inaway, received early venture funding from a Harrowell-controlled venture group called LoonCap Investments. The same group that funded predictive analytics firms and digital biometrics. Why would a family obsessed with surveillance and social control fund mindfulness apps? Because control doesn't always require force. Sometimes it just needs access. These guided meditations do more than relax. They install override protocols. Notice the patterns. Observe without judgment. Release your thoughts. Detach from your emotions. On the surface, it sounds peaceful, but psychologically, it's disassociation. You're training the mind to watch rather than act, to accept rather than confront. You're rehearsing obedience in stillness. And while you're lying still, your microphone is active, your biometric responses are recorded, your breathing patterns, your pauses, your voice samples. Don't believe it? Look into Calmcore's 2020 partnership with NeuroTrace, designed to optimize emotional modulation through predictive feedback. Translated, they used your sessions to map your mind's weak points. And the scripts? They're not random. Many are based on fragments from a 1964 document titled Sawai Form 17B, Induced Pacification Language, part of a declassified program on using hypnotic suggestion in mass civilian populations. It recommended voice timbre, phrase pacing, and word placement to bypass cortical resistance. These are the exact elements used in today's top meditation tracks. And it works. You feel clarity because your critical thinking is being muffled. You feel peace because your sense of urgency is being chemically silenced. It's not enlightenment, it's sedation. Your pursuit of self-mastery has been hijacked, turned into a ritual of passive surrender, and you were trained to thank them for it. In the next section, we dive into the deeper mechanism, how Harrowell-controlled wellness influences created a spiritual echo chamber, where questioning anything makes you the villain and blind faith in alignment keeps you docile. You've seen them. The softly lit Instagram reels, the TikTok lives with Himalayan salt lamps glowing in the background, smiling faces whispering about energy, healing, surrender, and letting the universe lead. But behind the crystals and affirmations lies one of the most effective modern tools of psychological pacification ever conceived. And yes, once again, the Harrowell fingerprints are there. In 2015, the Harmony Nexus Conference was launched in Sedona, Arizona, billed as a global summit for spiritual thought leaders and wellness influencers. What wasn't disclosed? The event was organized through a non-profit shell group called Unity Path, funded by a Harrowell holding firm linked to Arcadia Trust International. The agenda wasn't just about wellness, it was about harmonizing the message. Speakers were vetted, topics were filtered. The goal was singular: repackage ancient spiritual frameworks to erase personal sovereignty and promote energetic submission. Align with your highest self sounds empowering, until you realize the highest self they promote isn't sovereign, it's compliant. Think about the language: flow, surrender, release, accept, trust. These aren't bad words, but repeated enough in the right cadence and paired with emotional stimuli, they become behavioral scripts. You're not being taught to lead your life, you're being trained to follow vibrations. But whose? These influencers don't source their teachings from real ancient texts. They cherry-pick phrases, remove the accountability, and discard the fire of transformation for the comfort of conformity. The teachings of resistance, struggle, initiation, and confrontation, the sacred tension that births true awareness, are scrubbed. In their place, stay high vibe. Don't engage with negativity. You're out of alignment if you question too much. And just like that, spiritual growth becomes emotional obadiah. Ends. Dissent is now bad energy, anger is now low vibration, even curiosity is shamed as ego. That's not enlightenment, that's social anesthesia. And behind the curtain of these smiling guides are multi-channel content farms, run by AI, fine-tuned by behavioral scientists, all tracking engagement, watch times, and emotional keywords. Your healing is their algorithm, your compliance is their product, and the influencers, many are under quiet contracts, rewarded not just for reach, but for ideological consistency. So when you feel resistance and they say, just breathe through it, ask yourself, what are you breathing away, your fear or your awareness? In the next section, we expose the Harrowell doctrine itself, a leaked document outlining a 4-stage system of identity collapse and rehab centers across the world. The Harrowell doctrine was never meant to surface. It wasn't published, it wasn't leaked by accident. It was retrieved by a whistleblower buried deep inside an elite European rehabilitation facility where the world's wealthiest sent their troubled heirs for healing. What he uncovered wasn't therapy. It was transformation by deconstruction. The document, titled Doctrine of Reclamation, Identity Reset Protocols, outlined a precise 4-stage system designed to dismantle the self and rebuild it in the image of submission. Stage 1. Isolation initiation. The subject is removed from all familiar environments. No contact with family, no mirrors, no media. Their sense of self begins to fray. They are told this is for clarity. It's not. It's the first cut. Stage 2. Emotional flood. Through controlled exposures, music, repeated narratives, unpredictable sleep schedules, the nervous system is destabilized. Tears flow easily, time distorts, words lose meaning. They call it catharsis, it's erosion. Stage 3. Repatterning. Once the subject's identity is weakened, carefully curated mantras and narratives are introduced. You are safe when you listen. There is peace in obedience. These phrases are paired with dopamine rewards, food, warmth, eye contact. The subject bonds these comforts with compliance. Their neural pathways begin to rewire. Stage 4. Integration through aspiration. The new self is presented as superior to the old, more refined, more enlightened, more in control, so long as it continues to follow the program. Doubt is demonized as regression. Critical thought becomes a symptom to treat. The document includes line-by-line scripts, environmental suggestions, and even recommended tones of voice for facilitators. And it's not just used in private clinics. Variants of this doctrine have appeared in certain elite prep schools, spiritual retreats, executive leadership programs. The language differs, the function remains. Break the self, replace the will, call it growth. You were told healing takes time, but they've weaponized time. You were told you needed guidance, but they offered guardianship in chains. These programs do not produce strength, they produce silence, and silence is the currency of control. Ask yourself, how many people do you know who came back from a retreat, rehab, or program different, calmer, more passive, less curious? They didn't just change, they were reset. In the next section, we expose the psychological linchpin that makes all of this possible. A mechanism so fundamental, so embedded, that once you see it, you'll never unsee it again. The Harrowell influence reaches far beyond hidden retreats and private academies. It permeates the very fabric of everyday life, embedding itself in schools, corporations, and media networks. Public education, often praised as a cornerstone of democracy, is paradoxically one of the most efficient channels for behavioral conditioning. Curriculums are designed less for cultivating critical thought and more for standardizing obedience. Students are taught to regurgitate facts, conform to schedules, and suppress questions that challenge authority. The system rewards compliance with praise, grades, and social acceptance, while dissent invites isolation or punishment. In workplaces, the doctrine morphs into corporate culture. Mission statements filled with buzzwords like team synergy, alignment, and resilience mask an underlying pressure to conform and mute individual creativity. The cost of speaking out becomes social marginalization or stalled careers. Media, once a source of information and accountability, has become a curated stream of narratives designed to shape beliefs, fears, and desires. Algorithms promote content that reinforces existing biases, deepens divisions, and discourages nuance. Sensationalism crowds out subtlety. Opinions are weaponized. Thoughtful skepticism is drowned in noise. This is not coincidence. The same principles of the silent override apply. Confusion, emotional manipulation, and social pressure overwhelm the individual's capacity to think independently. In this environment, truth becomes relative, and authority is measured by reach, not integrity. The Harrowell doctrine exploits these vulnerabilities, feeding off the collective disorientation to tighten its grip. The more fragmented and distracted society becomes, the easier it is to herd individuals into predetermined roles, obedient consumers, passive voters, and silent observers. But the gray is a way out. In the next section, we delve into the ancient roots of this control system, how it traces back to secret societies and archaic power structures designed to shape human consciousness for millennia. Understanding this lineage is crucial if you seek to reclaim your sovereignty. The psychological chains forged by the Harrowell doctrine are not a modern invention. They are the latest iteration of an ancient blueprint of control that has shaped human consciousness for thousands of years. Secret societies like the Illuminati, the Rosicrucians, and the Freemasons have long been accused of manipulating the world's power centers, but beneath these whispered rumors lies a deeper, more pervasive truth. These groups inherited and refined methods developed by pre-Christian mystery schools, initiatory cults that guarded sacred knowledge and rites of passage designed to transform the soul. Over time, these rites were corrupted, twisted from paths of empowerment into tools of subjugation. What was once a journey into inner mastery became a spiral into external submission. The initiation ceremonies, once meant to break down ego to build higher awareness, were weaponized to fracture identity and enforce loyalty to hidden hierarchies. Symbols and rituals from labyrinths to secret handshakes, encoded psychological triggers, activating the silent override and ensuring that knowledge remained locked behind layers of obedience. The Harrowell family's historical ties to these societies are no coincidence. Their lineage intersects with bloodlines that controlled wealth, religion, and government. Families who understood that true power is not seized in public but wielded in the shadows through manipulation of belief and perception. This ancient architecture of control extends to religious institutions, many of which became co-opted by these bloodlines, converting spiritual guidance into spiritual imprisonment. Dogma replaced direct experience. Faith became unquestionable doctrine. The same mechanisms of emotional flood and repatterning persisted under new guises: confession, penance, and submission to clergy. Understanding this historical continuity reveals why the patterns we see today are not random or isolated. They are the same forces, evolving but consistent, designed to keep the masses unaware and compliant. To break free, you must recognize these patterns within yourself and society. In the next section, we expose how the Harrowell strategy uses technology as its latest amplifier, turning personal devices into conduits for control and manipulation unlike anything before. In the 21st century, the Harrowell strategy evolved with unprecedented precision through the integration of technology, transforming personal devices into sophisticated instruments of control. Smartphones, social media platforms, and digital assistants are no longer mere tools. They are psychological battlegrounds engineered to capture your attention, shape your thoughts, and manipulate your emotions. Every notification, like, and algorithmic suggestion is calibrated to exploit neural pathways involved in reward and addiction, triggering dopamine surges that reinforce dependence. The design is insidious. These devices create an illusion of connection and empowerment while steadily eroding your autonomy. The constant bombardment of fragmented information and emotionally charged content induces a persistent state of cognitive overload, effectively replicating the confusion and ambiguity central to the silent override. Surveillance technologies monitor behaviors and preferences, feeding data back into algorithmic loops that refine and escalate manipulation tactics. This digital ecosystem functions as a feedback mechanism, shaping collective consciousness by privileging certain narratives and censoring others. More than that, it fosters an environment where conformity is rewarded and dissent is silenced through social ostracism or deplatforming. The Harrowell family's influence is evident here as well. Their investments and connections have helped seed and cultivate many of the corporations and platforms that now dominate global communication. This convergence of ancient control systems with cutting-edge technology represents a quantum leap in the capacity to enforce compliance without visible chains. Yet this digital cage also offers a paradoxical opportunity. The very tools used to manipulate can be repurposed for awareness and resistance. The first step is to reclaim your attention as sacred, to choose consciously what and how you engage with the digital world. In the next section, we will explore specific mental disciplines and practices that can shield your mind and fortify your sovereignty against this pervasive assault. To reclaim your mind from the Harrowell web requires more than awareness. It demands disciplined cultivation of mental sovereignty through practices that restore clarity, focus, and resilience. Meditation, long dismissed by the mainstream as esoteric, is in fact a powerful tool for disrupting the neurological patterns of control. Through sustained practice, it reactivates the prefrontal cortex, strengthening your capacity for deliberate thought and emotional regulation, effectively weakening the silent override's grip. Equally important is mastering the art of selective attention, choosing what information to absorb and what to reject. This requires rigorous filtering of media, disengagement from sensationalist narratives, and embracing solitude where the mind can recalibrate free from external noise. Journaling acts as a mirror to your inner world, exposing subconscious conditioning and allowing you to consciously rewrite limiting beliefs implanted by manipulative systems. Physical disciplines, like rigorous exercise, cold exposure, and breath control, serve to recalibrate the autonomic nervous system, reducing chronic stress and restoring balance between fear and reason. Social boundaries must be reinforced as well. Toxic relationships and environments that reinforce compliance and conformity must be identified and, when possible, severed. These practices do not offer instant liberation. They are lifelong commitments to reclaiming your autonomy in a world engineered to strip it away. But the reward is profound. The emergence of an inner fortress that no external power can breach. This is the transformation the Harrowell family has fought to prevent, for it dismantles the very foundations of their control. Halfway through this journey, if you understand the gravity of these revelations and commit to awakening, I want you to comment the phrase, Shadow Breaker, Truth Seeker, twice below. This act locks in your identity shift and signals your readiness to dive deeper into forbidden truths. In the next sections, we will confront the psychological consequences of breaking free, the social fallout, and the hidden alliances that will seek to draw you back into darkness. Breaking free from the Harrowell grip is not without consequence. Those who awaken are met with internal turmoil and external resistance that tests their resolve to the core. The psychological fallout is intense. Cognitive dissonance erupts as your new awareness clashes violently with decades of conditioning. Feelings of isolation surge as old alliances dissolve and new communities have yet to form. The brain struggles to reconcile fragmented beliefs, creating anxiety, depression, and sometimes paranoia, symptoms of a mind in transformation but easily misdiagnosed or weaponized by those who wish to discredit you. On the outside, social fallout manifests in suspicion and hostility. Friends and family still entangled in the matrix of control may react with disbelief or even aggression, perceiving your awakening as a threat to the established order. Careers and reputations are at risk as subtle and overt tactics aim to silence dissenters. Disinformation campaigns, professional sabotage, or exclusion from networks. The Harrowell network excels at deploying such strategies, having cultivated extensive influence in media, politics, and academia to maintain their narrative monopoly. Yet this crucible of suffering is necessary. It is the rite of passage separating true seekers from the complacent. Those who endure emerge with a rare clarity and strength, no longer puppets but architects of their own destiny. Understanding this cost prepares you to face it without fear or regret. In coming sections, we will expose the hidden alliances that sustain the Harrowell legacy, the shadow governments, corporate cabals, and religious hierarchies bound by secrecy and mutual preservation. To dismantle this network, you must first map its architecture. The Harrowell legacy is sustained not by a single family or group, but by a complex web of interlocking alliances that span governments, corporations, religious institutions, and secret societies. Shadow governments operate behind the veneer of democracy, composed of unelected officials and intelligence operatives who orchestrate events on a global scale. These invisible hands steer conflicts, economic crises, and social unrest to consolidate power and distract the masses. Corporate cabals formed by conglomerates controlling everything from energy to pharmaceuticals manipulate markets and public health, enforcing dependencies that keep populations compliant and divided. Religious hierarchies, long corrupted by this network, maintain control by fostering dogmatic belief systems that discourage questioning and spiritual autonomy. These institutions share encrypted communications, covertly fund each other's agendas, and ruthlessly eliminate threats through legal, financial, or violent means. The Harrowell name appears repeatedly in leaked documents, financial records, and testimonies, always near the epicenter of controversial policies and cover-ups. Their influence is like a dark tide, flooding every major power structure with compliant agents and distorted narratives. Understanding this matrix reveals why systemic change is so difficult. The entire apparatus is designed to self-preserve at all costs, but with knowledge comes power. By identifying these alliances, you expose the seams of the system and create opportunities for disruption and resistance. The final section will guide you in translating this awareness into strategic action, how to protect yourself, build resilient networks, and ignite change that transcends fear and apathy. The path ahead is perilous, but the choice is yours. Remain a shadow in their game or become the light that shatters their darkness. Now that you have descended into the depths of the Harrowell family's macabre history and uncovered the hidden architectures of control that span centuries and permeate every layer of modern power, it is time to transform knowledge into action. True awakening is not passive. It demands courage, discipline, and strategic defiance. Begin by cultivating your inner sovereignty daily. Guard your mind fiercely against distractions, nurture your physical and emotional resilience, and maintain clarity of purpose. Build alliances with those who share your commitment to truth and freedom. Underground networks of trust are the lifeblood of resistance in a world designed to isolate and divide. Educate yourself continuously, but question everything, even the sources of your own knowledge, because control thrives where dogma replaces curiosity. Use technology deliberately, turning tools of manipulation into instruments of empowerment by prioritizing encrypted communication, privacy, and conscious consumption of information. Engage in acts of silent rebellion. Reject narratives that serve oppression. Speak truth where it is dangerous, and refuse complicity in systems that degrade human dignity. Remember, the Harrowell legacy is not inevitable. It is a construct maintained by fear, obedience, and silence. Your awakening fractures that foundation. Share these truths wisely, only with those who seek them, and prepare for the inevitable backlash, knowing that the greatest power lies in unyielding resolve and an unwavering commitment to freedom. This is not the end, but the beginning of a new chapter in your journey, one where you no longer walk in shadows but cast your own light into the darkness. The Harrowell history is a warning and a call to arms. Will you answer?